Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the City Building Ryerson Research and Focus workshop today. Today's theme is Women in Cities, Planning for Equity, and we offer this session today in celebration of International Women's Day. My name is Pamela Robinson. I'm the professor and the director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson University. I'm also the interim lead for City Building Ryerson. Thank you for coming and joining us today. We're going to start today's session with a land acknowledgement because if we were here together in person, we would be acknowledging the land on which Ryerson University sits. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, and it binds them together in the territory to share it and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. On this International Women's Day, I'd like to offer profound respect and thank you to the leadership of Ryerson colleagues who are leading Indigenous resurgent efforts, including Professor Summer Sutton, who is our newest colleague in the School of Urban and Regional Planning as an assistant professor, Dr. Lynn Lavallee, who is the Indigenous Resurgence Lead in the Faculty of Community Services, and Dr. Pam Palmater, who's a chair of Indigenous Governance. These women, among others at Ryerson, are leading the way in terms of helping us forge new pathways in terms of bringing Indigenous perspectives into the ways in which we operate our university. A few housekeeping matters. We're going to begin with our presentations, our presenters' research presentation this morning, followed by a moderated question and answer period. If some of you are repeat attendees, you'll know that normally these sessions run about 17 to 20 minutes. Today's will reach to 30 because there's so much interesting research to share. So there'll be a presentation for the first 30 minutes and then question and answers. If you have questions you'd like to ask, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. If someone else has asked a question that you find particularly compelling, you have the opportunity to vote it up to help make sure that we answer it at the beginning rather than towards the end. All audience microphones and cameras will be off, and you're welcome to participate through the question and answer period. This session, along with others, are going to be recorded and posted on the City Building Ryerson website. At the end of the formal presentation, we'll reach around 11:30. We'll pause and then we'll move into a part that's more interactive where the researchers and I and potentially members of the participating audience have a chance to ask questions with the microphone live too. We'll give you a chance to go if you've planned to join us only for the first 30 minutes. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Diana Petramala is a senior economist at the Center for Urban Research and Land Development at Ryerson University and the vice president of the board of the Toronto Association for Business and Economics. Prior to joining Ryerson, Diana was TD Bank's housing and real estate expert, where she spent a number of years as a macro forecaster. Her ongoing research interests lie in policy analysis with a focus on urban policy issues such as affordable housing, transit, and job creation. Welcome, Diana. Hannah Chan-Smyth is from the School of Urban and Regional Planning, where she's a second-year master's student, which means that as you find Hannah's research particularly compelling today, remember that she'll be finished in April and on the job market, so we're very excited for her. She's currently working on a master's research paper that focuses on gender mainstreaming in cities. She's also a research assistant in the Center for Urban Research and Land Development. In this presentation, our speakers will look at gender biases in city planning and how they can disadvantage women, with the example of Vienna as a city trying to undo the gender bias. The presenters will also discuss the role that gender mainstreaming can play in city planning in terms of supporting women's participation in the overall labor market and economic growth. Hopefully, we'll uncover lessons for cities around the world, including at home in Toronto and the GTHA. As an inequitable post-pandemic return to work is inevitable, which we all look forward to, we hope that we'll find longer-term guidelines and inspirations for creating cities that remove barriers faced by women. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Can everyone see the slide deck? Yep. Okay, great. Thank you, Pamela, for that introduction. I want to start off by saying that amidst these challenging and uncertain times, women and marginalized groups more broadly have been more severely impacted by the social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Women bear the brunt of unpaid responsibilities for children and elderly family members. They are at greater risk of domestic violence and are disproportionately disadvantaged by reduced access to sexual and reproductive health services. And with women being more likely to work part-time, they face greater job insecurity during times of economic instability. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hannah Chan-Smyth, and I'm a second-year master's student at Ryerson School of Urban and Regional Planning. Today, myself and Diana Petramala, senior economist at the Center for Urban Research and Land Development, are here to discuss gender mainstreaming in cities, as this is a powerful moment for change in Toronto. I want to start off by thanking everyone for taking the time to be here today, and a special thanks to City Building Ryerson for organizing today's event in honor of International Women's Day. In light of these challenging times, the good news is that the City of Toronto is launching a gender equality office this spring with the objective of developing an intersectional gender equity strategy to address the realities of women, girls, trans, and non-binary residents. Learning from Vienna's gender mainstreaming practices, today we are going to highlight the impacts of urban planning on gender and some key recommendations for creating cities that remove barriers faced by women in Toronto and cities around the world. To provide a bit of an agenda, today we will start off with a high-level discussion on gender and space. Diana will then provide some key indicators on gender and space within the Toronto context. We'll go on to define gender mainstreaming and what it means for planning. Using Vienna as a best practice, we will evaluate key elements of our cities through a gender lens. And finally, Diana will discuss some of the economic impacts of gender inequity in cities. The discussion on women in cities first emerged in the 1960s as women, inspired by the feminist movement, applied its principles to the urban environment to ultimately challenge men's position of power and authority over our urban form. This movement established the gendered city as a manifestation of the patriarchy in the urban form. The architectural design and urban planning principles of the time confined women to traditional roles of unpaid labor, and power was expressed through the suburbanization of the nuclear family housing unit and the idealization of this notion that a woman's place is in the home. Our cities were built based on this 1950s way of life, whereby the man goes to work and the woman stays home with the children, and as a result, our cities' urban areas have been centered on this relationship between home and work. But as women have entered the workforce in larger and larger numbers, they are finding themselves physically, socially, and economically constrained, trying to manage paid and household work in the existing design of our cities. Women, children, and elderly have much broader spatial relationships, including those between home, green space, school, recreation, shops, etc., which means that women, or those who take on the brunt of household work, have more complex travel patterns and more varied needs in public space that were not accommodated in this older model. Taking care of children and elderly relatives and managing household duties means that women are often making many lateral movements to childcare, shops, appointments, and work, compared to one radial journey to and from work. What this means is that the spatial relationship between home, services, and work impacts women's time, energy, and productivity. Women, children, and elderly persons also have different needs in public space. Children, strollers, grocery bags, and elderly all require space and move at varying speeds. Wide sidewalks, a well-placed bench, high-quality parks, and good lighting at all times of the day help facilitate the needs of different users and can mean the difference between someone engaging in the community or not at all. In the case of this pandemic and stay-at-home orders, for those of you who have transitioned to working from home, you might be able to empathize with how important access to amenities, including outdoor space and services like groceries and healthcare, is when your everyday life is tied to the home. And in addition to access, there's also quality. High quality sidewalks today are better able to facilitate social distancing and provide users with some space during this challenging time. I'm now going to pass it off to Diana, who will talk about gender and space in the Toronto context.
You're just on mute, Diana.
Sorry about that. I'm going to try and visualize some of the concepts that Hannah just went through data. And first, we're going to look at the differences in ways men and women engage in the labor market. So in this chart here, we're looking at labor force participation rate. So that's the share of males and females between the age of 15 and 64 who are either employed or actively looking for work. The top blue line, solid blue line, are males in the Toronto CMA, and the bottom yellow line are females. And there are a few takeaways from this chart. The first is that women are less likely to engage in the labor market than males by a significant amount. The second one is not evident in this chart, but women are twice as likely to work part-time in the Toronto CMA than men are. So even when they do engage in the labor market, they're working less hours than men do. And the third one is that the way women engage with the labor market is a function of where they live. So if we compare the labor force participation rates in the Toronto CMA relative to the average of other CMAs in Canada, we see that women in Toronto are less likely to work than average women in other areas of Canada. So there's something inherent in the city that is determining the degree to which women participate in the labor market. Next slide, please, Hannah. And there's also differences in the way that women and men spend their time. So we're looking at how men and women divide their time up between unpaid work. So these are chores, things like grocery shopping and childcare, commuting to and from work, and paid and unpaid work, and then how much time they spend on work. And what we see is that men and women spend almost exactly the same amount of time on all three of these tasks combined, but they divide their time differently among the three tasks. Women tend to spend or do spend significantly more time on unpaid work. So this is the gray bar in this chart than men do. What's really interesting is that the differences in how men and women spend their time between unpaid and paid work, the difference is greatest for those who are 35 to 44 years of age. So these are the middle two bars. So women who are in their prime years for developing their career are spending significantly more time on unpaid work than men are. What's really interesting here too is that women spend, even though they have more irregular commutes, so men tend to commute just from work to home, whereas women will commute from work to home, to grocery store, to pick up kids at school, to doctor's appointments for children. They spend equally as much time commuting. And this is by choice. Women choose to commute less for work and more for other unpaid work, because commuting to work has a higher opportunity cost for women. Next slide, please. Now, when we break down how men and women commute specifically for employment reasons, there is a significant differences between men and females as well. So 60% of women, or 60% of transit users in the Toronto CMA are female. And what's really interesting here is in the city of Toronto, for women, or if we look at the differences between men and women by neighborhood, women are less likely to work in neighborhoods that don't have as good transit neighborhoods as transit access as neighborhoods that do have really good transit. So transit is the preferred source of transportation for females when it is available. Women are more beholden to commuting within their home, close to their home. So 40% of men commute greater than 50 kilometers of where they live, compared to just 30% of females. Females are also more likely to commute within their own census division, so the city within they live in. So city of Toronto, women are more likely to commute within the city of Toronto. If they live in York, they're more likely to commute within York for work. So the implications of all of these are that women are beholden to jobs that are nearest to their home. And the implications of this are, as cities push families further out into the suburbs, this means that women are more likely to take on lower paid service jobs because they are of more abundance in the suburbs. So now we're going to pass the presentation over to Hannah, who's going to talk about how gender mainstreaming, particularly in Vienna, can help and even the keel between men and women in the labor market.
Thanks, Diana. So what is gender mainstreaming and what does it mean for planners? The concept of gender mainstreaming emerged in the 1990s in response to women's call for action for structural changes to our policy practices across all disciplines, including land use planning. The Council of Europe defines gender mainstreaming as the reorganization, improvement, development, and evaluation of policy processes so that a gender equality perspective is incorporated in all policies at all levels and stages. In this concept, gender can be understood as gender plus, which goes beyond biological and sociocultural genders and also includes the many characteristics we intersect with, such as race, ethnicity, religion, age, mental and physical disability, etc. For planners, architects, and city builders alike, gender mainstreaming is not just about gender, it's about creating fair shares in the city for all user groups and ultimately better serving the common interest. Today, we are looking to Vienna for best practices on gender-sensitive planning. Vienna has been gender mainstreaming for 20 years now, and between 2005 and 2010, the city implemented over 50 gender mainstreaming pilot projects, ranging from streetscapes and parks to master planned communities. The lessons learned from their approach have highlighted the possibility of gender mainstreaming for cities around the world, including Toronto. Within Vienna's gender mainstreaming activities lie three key strategic principles that I think are worth noting. The first is reframing the understanding of work to include unpaid housework and family tasks. The second is planning for different life phases. Like mentioned earlier, our city is made up of people in all life stages with different needs and different relationships with space. And lastly, it's reinforcing a polycentric urban model, a concept I'll go into in more detail in a few slides. Learning from these key principles in Vienna's gender mainstreaming practices, we can compare Vienna and Toronto's urban model, transit, density, built form, housing, and budget through a gender perspective. Vienna follows a polycentric urban model, which means that housing, jobs, services, and institutions are distributed evenly across the city. In comparison, Toronto resembles more of a monocentric urban model, with a high-density business district at the center and suburbs radiating outward, all being connected by highways and roads. This means that housing and residential neighborhoods are spatially disconnected from social services and jobs. These two urban models have many implications on transit and mobility for women. As mentioned earlier, women typically have more complex commute patterns, balancing work with their responsibilities at home. Vienna's polycentric model is based on the idea of a city of short distances, high-quality public space, environmentally friendly transit, and a safe and barrier-free city. This means clustering transit services and amenities together to reduce commute times and maximize time and flexibility for working women. An example of this in practice can be seen here in this everyday route analysis done for Vienna's Aspern Lakeside Master Plan to evaluate if users' everyday needs are accommodated within the plan. These two very different urban models have contributed to different levels of density in Vienna and Toronto. There's this cool website noted there at the bottom that we can use to visualize population density in cities around the world. And as you can see here, Toronto follows this monocentric shape with a very high density urban core with gradually decreasing density as you move outward. Whereas in Vienna, you can see it's totally different and actually quite uniform across the city. This is representative of the polycentric model having jobs and amenities distributed across the city. And this can also be seen looking at their skylines, where you can see Vienna having kind of a uniform 6 to 8 story built form, and Toronto's skyline being scattered with high rises. And you might be thinking that, well, Toronto must have a lot more population or geographic limitations that are contributing to this difference, but they're actually not that dissimilar. And as you can see, both Vienna and Toronto have about 4,600 people per kilometer squared. So what does this all mean for the built form? Vienna recommends housing developments have a maximum floor area ratio of 2.0 and a maximum of 30 to 40 units per entrance to enhance neighborly relations and limit unwanted anonymity. Vienna also highlights the important relationship between housing and green space, specifically for watching children. Once a building is over 6 stories, parents can no longer hear or see their kids playing. Having the safe and accessible public space for households allows parents to multitask and accomplish other chores. In Toronto, our communities land on either side of this spectrum, with a very dense high-rises in the urban core and low-rise single-family homes in the stable neighborhoods outside the downtown. This is resulting in that missing middle that we talk about a lot. For housing, there are 2 important things to note. The first is housing model. Vienna has a supply-side oriented housing model, whereby their housing subsidies and incentives are mostly targeted to developers. In Toronto and Canada more generally, our housing model is more demand-side focused, with subsidies and incentives such as favorable mortgage insurance terms are directed to buyers. The second is housing quality. Vienna's supply-side focus means that they can demand a lot from their developers. The city uses a unique developer competition model, whereby development sites undergo an RFP process to select the developer. They're able to do this as part of the terms for providing those subsidies, or as part of the terms for using either partly or entirely publicly owned land. This process allows the city to set a really high standard for housing quality, public realm, and amenities. How is gender analysis contributing to housing developments? Well, developments and capital projects are complex, mechanically demanding, and involve many stakeholders. Gender mainstreaming provides space for considering the trade-offs and their impact on various user groups. For example, the importance of large floor plates and unit sizes that can accommodate families, or when considering the trade-offs between adding additional parking stalls or public space. The last thing I want to mention is the gender budgeting process. Gender budgeting is an application of gender mainstreaming in the budgetary process. It means a gender-based assessment of budgets, incorporating a gender perspective at all levels of the budgetary process, and restructuring revenues and expenditures in order to promote gender equality. The budget is important to talk about because the allocation of resources represents the government's commitment and action to specific objectives and desired outcomes. Given their political nature, the reality is that our budgets are not gender neutral. Not all programs and expenditures equally serve men, women, children, various income groups, race, and so on. It's important that we analyze the impact of our program on all user groups and identify gaps. And one way of doing this is gender budgeting. Just to note that gender budgeting is not a separate budget for women or limited to budget allocations for programs for women. It encompasses the whole budget across all departments in both revenues and expenditures. There are 3 broad categories of gender budgeting. The first is gender-informed resource allocation that considers the impact of policies and funding on gender equality. The second is gender-assessed budgets that analyzes the impact of the budget as a whole on gender. And the last is needs-based gender budgeting, whereby budget decisions are based on an understanding of gender inequalities and gender needs. An example of needs-based gender budgeting can be found in Vienna's Miedling district, where their data showed that women were mostly using public transit and pedestrian ways compared to men who were mostly using cars and bicycles. This understanding informed their decision to do a €6 million redevelopment of their main street to better accommodate women's commute patterns. Some of the key takeaways that I ask everyone to kind of percolate after this presentation is this. Our cities are in fact gendered cities, and the reality is that women and men, or paid work and household work, have different but equally important spatial needs. The second is that gender mainstreaming is really about advocating for healthy communities where all people are equally considered and their activities are valued and facilitated. And the last two is that not all housing is created equal. Building housing without consideration for the needs of different users and the type of housing different users needs can disproportionately affect women. Moreover, rampant housing unaffordability that drives young families and middle-income households to the suburban fringes disproportionately impacts women economically, socially, and physically. So to conclude, I'm going to pass it off to Diana, who's going to talk about the economic impact of gender mainstreaming in cities.
The biggest benefit to gender mainstreaming in planning would be to increase the labor force participation rate among women. And this happens by reducing the time spent on unpaid work or by providing good paid jobs within a reasonable commute of where women live. So here we're looking at the gender wage gap. So this is women's income, average women's income relative to men's by census division across Canada, and its relationship to average commute duration. There is a lot of research that suggests that female labor force participation is far more correlated to commute times than even to access to childcare. And what we're seeing here is there is a negative relationship. For census divisions that households have to commute further for jobs, we have bigger gaps between what women earn relative to men. And the gender, I'm moving from labor force participation rate to the gender wage gap for a few reasons, because the gender wage gap is impacted by a few things. So the first is there is the wage discrimination within industries. That's not anything that planning can sort of help, but there are three other factors that I think planning can target. The first is the number of hours women spend working. The second is the degree to which women are willing to participate in the labor market. And the third is the type of jobs that women take on. So the closer they are to better paying jobs, the more likely they are to take on those jobs. So not only can gender mainstreaming and planning help encourage more women to work, it also can help close the gender wage gap. Next slide, please. And here's just a bit of a look at how gender mainstreaming in planning may have impacted Vienna over time. Here we've showed labor force participation rates for females aged 15 to 64, Vienna versus Toronto. Vienna has structurally a lower labor force participation rate than Toronto. So in 1998, before gender mainstreaming was implemented, the labor force participation rate for women was actually 58% versus Toronto, which had a labor force participation rate of around 70%. But since they've taken on gender mainstreaming, you've seen an increase in the labor force participation rate to 69.2%. So that's almost 11 percentage point increase. Whereas Toronto has seen only a 4% increase in the labor force participation rate among women over that time period. And in fact, labor force participation rate for women has declined slightly between 2008 and 2019. Next slide, please. Now, the federal government has an economic objective of getting more women to work. And the reason that is because Canada has an aging population. And the goal of getting more women to work is to help boost the economy, but also to help buffer government revenues at a time when their expenditures are going to go up because of an aging population. But specific monetary policies to get women to work can encourage labor force participation rates to increase, but that comes at the expense of how many children women have, and thereby being future population growth. And population growth is an important determinant of long-run economic growth. So here we're looking at, again, labor force participation rates among women 15 to 64, and then how many children women aged 15 to 45, that's the main age that women start having or have children over time. And we switched to Ontario here only because I wanted to take a longer historical perspective on it. And what we do see is that as labor force participation rates among women increased between 1976 and 1990, we saw a decline in the fertility rate among women. Even more recently, we've seen a bit of an increase in the fertility rate, but we've also seen a decrease in the labor force participation rate. So the best way to target or getting women to work while still encouraging women to continue to have children and families is not just monetary incentives, but also, again, alleviating some of the unpaid work and commute times for women. Interestingly, the wage differential, for example, has been closing the quickest for high-paying management jobs in the Toronto CMA, but that has not encouraged any more participation in those jobs by females. I think still the time constraint is a big factor for women engaging in the labor market and taking on high-paying jobs. Next slide, please. The impact of the pandemic increases the need, I think, for some of these initiatives to help women get back to work. So the recession has been coined a she-cession, implying that the pandemic is going to have a bigger impact on women. We haven't really seen this in the unemployment rates or the job losses. They've been equally pretty much spread in the Toronto CMA across men and women. And this is largely because women make up a lot of a big chunk of the essential workers, particularly in education and healthcare. What is important is the long-term consequences of the pandemic on women's careers. So for those who have more management-like jobs, women are less likely to work from home. I think in large part because women still feel like they have to prove themselves in the labor market. So the work from home aspect is likely to impact women significantly more from a long-term perspective than men. The fact that women take on the bigger brunt of household chores is likely impacting women more now, particularly as they've been having to deal with children being at home more, less help with childcare, educating their virtual learning, so providing support for virtual learning for their kids, but also just household chores have become increasingly more burdensome because of the pandemic. You go to the grocery store and you have to wait in line, it takes you much longer, or you have to go during specific hours. And you're at home more, so there are more chores to do as you clean up after your family. Another important trend is the shift in households from the city of Toronto to the suburbs that we've seen. So as we do eventually get back to work in the following the pandemic, women are now going to be straddled with a much larger commute, and that might impact their willingness and ability to come back to work. And then economists like to give letters to shapes of economic recoveries. And this one here is being called a K-shaped recovery. This has a couple of implications for women. So what this actually means is that some industries are going to recover much faster than other industries. The industries that will recover tend to be more tech related, and they are more heavily male dominated than other industries. And then the second one here is wealthier families are going to do well, while lower income families are going to struggle more. And this has implications for women because if you think about a family who can afford to outsource unpaid work versus a family who cannot, the woman in the family that can afford to outsource unpaid work are going to have a significantly easier time getting back into the labor market versus the women who cannot. So significantly more burdens for women coming out of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we do think that the benefits of gender mainstreaming and planning outweigh the costs. The benefits include higher female labor force participation rates, but maybe perhaps not coming at the expense of fertility rates, and then an overall more equitable city. The tax revenues, if we look at Vienna hasn't really tracked what the impact has been on their budgets, but if you look at their budget sources, one of the biggest changes that's happened since they've implemented gender mainstreaming, as more women have been working, their tax revenue has gone up by about $1 billion. On the cost side, you do have admin costs. You have to have more people doing the gender mainstreaming planning. Infrastructure costs cost money to have transit options and expand sidewalks. And then there's the opportunity cost of other investments. When we look at the Vienna model, the biggest increase in costs occurred again among the admin costs. That was a $100 million increase. And then infrastructure investments, they did spend more on education and preschool. And that was again another $100 million worth of that. So it's $200 million worth of additional costs to get $1 billion worth of more revenue. So in conclusion, we do believe that the benefits far outweigh the costs. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Hannah and Diana. So we're up at 11:35. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right into the questions that have come from our attendees. And if you're still here and with us, we hope that you'll keep asking and answering questions for us. So I'm going to start with the first one. And all of these, our participants haven't named themselves, so I'm just going to refer to them as anonymous attendees. So the first question is, what are some solutions to transform Toronto into a gendered city?
Hannah, do you want to take that one?
Yes. First, should I stop sharing the presentation?
Good idea. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the question. Some solutions for Toronto, I think, in creating less gendered city. I think, like we mentioned, a lot of it comes down to density and kind of mixed uses, and Toronto still kind of has our land uses are quite segregated. And so I think continuing to explore, filling that missing middle and mixing uses to provide, job opportunities and amenities closer to home can really kind of help reduce that commute time and provide women with some more flexibility and time for other things. The other thing that I think is really important to mention is the need for gender disaggregated data. In Vienna, a lot of the recommendations start with you need to have the data in order to make educated decisions. And so that, I think, is kind of the first step for cities and administration and government to start, is by collecting high quality gender disaggregated data and starting there.
Okay, thanks. The next question actually comes more as feedback to you as presenters, and I'm going to ask a question that follows on it, but I want to read it out loud for everyone from a different attendee. I noticed that your presentation commented on biological gender, as well as switching between women and females on certain slides. I'd like to point out that this conflation is not an accurate portrayal of gender or sex and essentializes the experiences of women in our cities. Not to mention that gender mainstreaming can be useful for more than just women, including those who are non-binary and gender fluid. In the future, please include this analysis in your data collection and presentation to recognize these experiences, even if you're still presenting specifically on data around women. So my question for you is this: given how data-driven this work is, what's the state of collecting data about gender in terms of its progressive reflection of us moving beyond the binary gender of men and women to include people who identify as women, to include people who are trans? How does that work in terms of data collection? Do you have recommendations for the city of Toronto in terms of its gender mainstreaming work? Like, are other cities leading the way here, like San Francisco, for example? What's the state of data collection to actually reflect the true gender fluidity that we see in our communities?
So I'm going to let Hannah take a bit of the view on gender mainstreaming. We focused here on men versus women because today was International Women's Day, so we wanted to keep the presentation within 30 minutes. Otherwise, you can really go through a whole number of different issues based on perceived gender. In terms of the data collection, the economic data, when we do get the census data, might be a little bit easier to do a bit more analysis on various different types of genders. I believe that they will ask these questions in the census. But a lot of the labor force data that I did use in this presentation are only available for female versus male. And this is not a city problem. This is a national Statistics of Canada sort of problem. So there is room for Statistics Canada to start providing more detailed gender data in their labor force statistics program for sure. And Hannah's going to talk now, or Hannah will talk a bit now about what gender mainstreaming is actually going to look like in the city of Toronto and why that's important.
Yeah, it's definitely important to note that, gender mainstreaming definitely receives, criticisms about kind of about that, generalization and I think that the term gender mainstreaming and that kind of focus on binary gender, can kind of come through. And I did speak with actually Eva Kale, the kind of gender mainstreaming expert, and gender mainstreaming really is not about that binary understanding of gender. It is not binary. Like we mentioned, it's gender plus. It goes beyond both biological and sociocultural genders. And in Toronto specifically, the gender kind of mainstreaming gender equality office is focusing on an intersectional approach. So I think that's really important, and it goes beyond, the biological and sociocultural, but also includes the many characteristics that we intersect, and especially in Toronto, we're such a multicultural city. It's very, very important. And to Diana's point, there's a lot of room for improvement for our data collection, and that's definitely the first area I think that we need to start.
Also a good opportunity for all of us as researchers when starting out data-driven research collection, just to be mindful of how to make sure that we align the ways in which we ask our questions with the kinds of data and the actual normative outcomes that we're hoping to accomplish. It's great. Okay. From Erica Woyburn, how do we move to supply-based housing affordability policies? Is it even possible here? Hear me in Toronto.
Yeah, supply and demand. I think, I think that in the bigger picture, demand, I don't want to bash demand side policies. I think they create a lot of flexibility for cities. I think the key thing here is a bit of a balance. And when you only focus on the demand side and don't, help the supply side, you can end up kind of what we're seeing in Toronto, which is this, imbalance of so many, millennials trying to start their families and need a little bit more space. And our supply in the kind of stable neighborhoods is very, very restricted. And, there's definitely correlations in our studies that show that, supply restrictions have an impact on housing prices. So I think there's room for it. I definitely think that there's room to evaluate, what our supply restrictions are on the stable neighborhoods and avenues, and where we can kind of create some space there to help balance that demand supply relationship.
So what Hannah is talking about is removing regulation barriers to supply can be the most affordable option of doing it. So to help keep young families at least in the city and closer to their jobs. I do think that we need to think a lot about not just the supply of housing too, but the supply of jobs and where those jobs tend to go. And one of the reasons why Toronto has become so monocentric, in my view, is because of the Toronto CMA. Because we need to start thinking a little bit more broadly with households moving further out into the suburbs, and we have to stop thinking in isolation. The City of Toronto doesn't just operate in isolation. Most of the labor force is living outside of the City of Toronto, commuting in, is where jobs also go. And I think Toronto is fairly monocentric because most of the rental supply moves into the City of Toronto. It accounts for almost 80% of the rental supply, and jobs are going to go where they have the biggest access to labor. And people coming out of jobs tend to be renters, not owners. So they're going to live where they can find rental units. So if we want to think about spreading jobs a bit more across the region, we have to start thinking about where rental markets are going and how we subsidize perhaps the rental markets. And Canada does have a bit of history in subsidizing purpose-built rentals, particularly through tax incentives. We hasn't done so since the late 1970s, but there is historical perspective on that.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How will the unpaid services being handled by women be provided once women fully enter the workforce? Or is public support for this unpaid work, for example, low-cost daycare, actually the strategy to get women into the workforce?
Well, Hannah, do you want to take that, or would you like me to take it?
I'm just trying to read the question again. Just to make sure that I understand it. How will the unpaid services being handled by women be provided once women are fully?
So who's going to do the work if women go back to work? I think is how I read that question. Diana, is that your read of the question too?
Yeah, I really like the sort of Vienna model in terms of they tried to reduce the burden through city planning of unpaid work. So if you think about the idea of low-rise apartments, it's because they can let their kids out to play as opposed to spending time in a park with them, and they can hear them. I do, though, think a lot of it has to fall on preschool or daycare and education. So again, one of the biggest investments Vienna has made since doing gender mainstreaming has been in education and preschool. And I feel like if you think about the commute, the biggest constraint for women participating in the labor market is the number of hours they can spend in the labor force. So for instance, it was a millennial task force for encouraging women to lean in. So in one of the major banks. And the biggest issue was getting women to stay at work longer, or if they had to leave early to go pick up their kids from daycare, to being willing to sign in to work after once they've put their kids to bed and have a bit more free time. But if you were to have, and one of the constraints there is that women have to be at their they have to commute far to get to daycare to pick up their kids. And then but they have to be there by a specific time, usually between 5 and 6. So if you're commuting an hour, that means that you have to leave work quite early. So one of the things I've learned about some other cities is that they put daycares closer to the place of employment rather than the place of home, so that you can spend more time at work and then you have a smaller commute until you have to pick up your children at daycare. I think is one good way of helping alleviate some of that stress.
It's so interesting if we think about the return to work post-pandemic, and what most people are predicting will be a greater shift towards hybrid, both working from home and perhaps sometimes going into the office for people whose work allows that to happen. This specific location of childcare becomes even trickier to plan for, because if you're going to work 5 days a week, you could choose to co-locate your daycare and your work. But if you're half working at home and half working at the office, things start, it adds another layer of complexity to the co-location piece of the equation. Hey, it's interesting.
I'm curious to know, it'll be interesting to see how many people actually choose, like whether that hybrid happens or if people really do end up going back to work. Again, women tend to be in professions where working from home is not as easy. So like 3 times as many women are working in healthcare and education services than men. Like that is by far the biggest industries that women work in, and those are not work from home industries, right? Those are going to be the first to open, and particularly we've seen schools already open. So I don't know, I'm a little less certain that we're going to have more of a hybrid, and I think people will get back to work. And again, women are still, when they work, they like to be at work. They're less likely to work from home than men are.
So I think that question, your answer, Diana, answers the next question on the list that's been voted up, which is working from home is the ultimate reduction of the commute. Does this new acceptability of this option due to the pandemic experience help some women? And so I think, we'll see if it results in it. I think the other piece of this that the pandemic has presented is that people are working from home, but they're also educating their children at home. And so you may not be commuting, but now you're being a teacher and doing your full-time job. Which adds a further layer of complexity, says me, the panel host who has experienced that for the last year, starting this week. Okay, next one. This is a really specific one, back to your first graph, so you might want to have a look. The attendee asks, is the first graph taking into consideration those who are seeking an education? Could that perhaps be a factor in why fewer women are in the labor market because they're more likely to pursue a higher education, or is that considered?
Women are more educated than men. That is considered. I did break that down by various age groups to see if it was different between, younger millennials who are working versus, those who are at just starting their careers, and then women who are mid-career. And it's actually the labor force participation rate actually decreases with age for men and women. What's really interesting is that the willingness of a woman to work in the labor force actually changes quite substantially when she gets married. Not even when she has children, but even when women enter marriage. So men are their biggest source of unpaid work. Sorry.
It's so interesting in all of in so many of the research assumptions and the research writ large, it tackles trying to make it easier for women to see the children and work rather than trying to unpack the gender inequity that involves the responsibility of looking at the kids being on the woman in the first place, right? There's so many interesting challenges in all of this. Okay.
Well, it's not just the child care, it's all work. I think it's amazing how even during the pandemic, I realized we have no children, but the amount of, and this is anecdotal, I know, but the amount of the household burdens that have fallen on me relative to my partner is quite substantial. I mean, I'm not thinking about it. I force him to do his chores, but it's it's really interesting. It's just who automatically takes them on is very set, I think, as one of those biases.
Yeah, there's so much invisible work: elder care, care for neighbors, the list goes on. Okay, question, really tangible one. What impact does access to accessible daycare play in women participating in the paid workforce? And I think the piece that follows from this is comparing in Vienna to Toronto. Is there anecdotal or is there evidence from the data set that shows that the affordability of daycare makes a difference? Or is that beyond the scope of your work?
Not Vienna, but I would say Statistics Canada has done a lot of this work on the difference between Quebec and other provinces in Canada. And so Quebec has a relatively high labor force participation rate for women and high fertility rates. And the cheapest and the major difference between Quebec and the other provinces is the affordability of daycare.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next question. This relates to the assertion that if we're trying to fill in the gap with relationship to density, does that automatically lead to gentrification or displacement of people from equity-seeking communities or marginalization of people with economic precarity?
I think this is a good question, and I'm glad it was asked. Definitely and this is something that I'm, working on in my research. A criticism of the polycentric model, or kind of filling in this gap that you mentioned of adding, facilities and amenities to neighborhoods, that increases the value of that land, and can thereby also increase the housing prices and result in displacement. And I think this comes back to that supply and demand discussion because, Vienna has, I think, been able to manage this well because they have a very aggressive supply side model where they're adding a lot of social housing every year. They add about 10,000 units of social housing every year. And 60% of Viennese people live in social housing and pay less than 20% of their income on housing. So I think that that's a very important question to talk about in this conversation, and I think that supply and demand relationship is important too in social housing to kind of mitigate that.
Okay, we're at 11:56. I'm going to combine two questions, one from Mary Pickering and another one that got bumped up. Mary asked, how might gender-informed planning overlap with net zero carbon city goals, and how might we create intersectional synergies? So there's the carbon gender combination. And a question that also received a couple of votes asks about things like planning and design policies for things like parking lots and parks and open spaces. So what are some specific things that could happen, or is there a particular alignment that could both speak to the climate action plan, but also other parks and open space policies?
I have an answer, but Hannah, do you have an answer? Do you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Well, I mean, Vienna plans specifically for green space, and there's a lot of research now, it's not fairly old, but on the sort of impacts of density on the environment. In fact, even transit-oriented developments that tend to lead to higher density, the conversation is now moving away from them being environmentally friendly to just being economically friendly. Taller buildings, more density, for example, downtown Toronto tends to come with less green space, less trees, and trees absorb carbon or offset the impact of carbon. Taller buildings, I think, are not, even if you try, are not as economically environmentally friendly as, or environmentally friendly as low-rise buildings. They tend to need more material and have higher carbon output. So the combination of less green space and more emissions from buildings deteriorates environmental objectives. Whereas a model like Vienna, where they plan for more green space, they plan for lower rise density, or more density through lower rise, is more economically environmentally friendly. And also, they can plan for more active forms of transport in what they're doing.
Hannah, do you want to add anything before we wrap up?
I think that Diana did a good job.
I think the interesting thing is that, like, if you look at the work that Toronto is doing with its Gender Plus analysis, with its Transform Toronto Climate Action Plan, Toronto was really trying to take an intersectional approach, which I think is the right thing to do. Ultimately, a city that is more climate friendly needs to be more equitable and diverse and inclusive, right? It needs to be responsive to its community members. And these kinds of strategies are likely to be more successful the more we center the experiences of people doing the work, whether it's paid or unpaid, in community providing leadership. In our case, in a lot of around progressive community work in the city, there are women and people who identify as women doing very powerful, impactful work. And so, Mary, I think there is a tremendous opportunity for alignment because so many of the shared values are the same, right? Whether it's building energy retrofits or it's making park spaces more accessible and safer in a wider range of hours. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up here at 11:59. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. I'd like to thank Hannah and Diana for sharing their research with us. And I'd like to thank the team at City Building Ryerson for once again creating this platform for Ryerson researchers to share their impactful city building focused work. Happy International Women's Day to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Take care.